I am standing in a hospital ward in the 1840s, and I am watching a doctor's work. He has just come from the autopsy room where he was cutting open a corpse, and now he is examining a woman who is about to give birth. I used to think that the people trying to save you were always the safest people to be around. It seemed like a fact. But I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about why so many mothers were dying. But why did the people in charge not see the danger? It is strange, right? You have these highly educated men, the best in Vienna, and they are standing right in the middle of a catastrophe. At the time, they had all these complicated ideas about why mothers were dying from what they called childbed fever. They blamed the weather. They blamed bad air. They blamed the way the hospital was built. They even blamed the mothers themselves, their constitution, or their emotions. But there was a deeper belief that was even more dangerous. Doctors were seen as gentlemen, and in the 1840s, a gentleman's hands were considered clean. The very idea that a doctor could be carrying death from one room to another was not just seen as wrong, it was seen as an insult to the entire profession. They were not looking at their hands because they did not think there was anything to see. They were looking for mysterious causes in the air instead. I want you to picture the kitchen. Imagine a cook is handling raw meat that has started to spoil. His hands might look perfectly fine to the naked eye, but as he moves from that meat to a fresh salad, he is carrying something invisible on his skin. He does not see it, and he certainly is not trying to make anyone sick. He is just doing his job. But the danger here is not coming from a draft in the room, or the way the kitchen is decorated. It is in contact. This is what we call cross-contamination. It is a simple physical transfer. One surface touches another, and a bit of poison hitches a ride. In a kitchen, we understand this instinctively today, but in a hospital in the 1840s, this idea of a hidden path was completely missing from the way people thought about medicine. Now, that is exactly how the hospital in Vienna worked. The doctors and the medical students would spend their mornings in the autopsy room, dissecting bodies to learn about disease. Then they would walk right across the hall to the maternity ward to examine the women about to give birth. I want you to see the problem here. It was a transfer problem. They were like the cooks I mentioned, moving from the raw meat to the fresh meal without ever stopping to wash their hands. Childbed fever was not a mysterious curse or bad air floating through the windows. It was something physical that the doctors were carrying on their skin and rubbing into the mothers. It was simple, direct contact. The hospital was not just a place where people died. It was the place where the transmission chain was being completed every single day. This is where one doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed something that did not make any sense. He was working at the Vienna General Hospital, which had two different maternity clinics. They were in the same building and used the same equipment, but there was a massive difference between them. The first clinic, where the doctors and medical students worked, was far more dangerous than the second clinic, which was run by midwives. In the doctor's clinic, the death rate was often 10 times higher. It was so bad that when women arrived at the hospital, they would literally beg on their knees to be admitted to the midwives' clinic instead. Some would even prefer to give birth in the street. That haunted him. He saw that if this were just about bad air or the weather, both clinics should have been equally deadly, but they were not. There was a gap, and that gap meant there had to be a specific reason why one group of people was carrying death while the other was not. So he started crossing things off the list. He looked at crowding. But it turned out the midwives' clinic, the safe one, was more crowded. He looked at the way the women were lying down. Maybe the birthing position mattered. He changed the position in the first clinic to match the second. Nothing happened. He even looked at the priest. In the first clinic, A priest would walk through the ward ringing a bell when someone died. And Semmelweis wondered if the fear was literally scaring the other mothers to death. He had the priest walk a different way and stop ringing the bell. It did not matter. The mothers in the first clinic kept dying at the same terrifying rate. This is the part that gets me. He was stripping away every possible excuse. He was proving that the problem was not the room. It was not the air. And it was not the patient's state of mind. It had to be something the doctors were doing differently. I want to show you how one man started to pull this apart. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, and he was working at the Vienna General Hospital. He noticed something that did not make any sense. The hospital had two maternity clinics sitting right next to each other, using the same rooms and the same equipment. But there was a massive difference in the numbers. In the first clinic, which was run by doctors and medical students, mothers were dying at a terrifying rate. In the second clinic, which was run by midwives, the death rate was much lower. It was so bad that women would literally beg on their knees to be admitted to the midwives' ward. Some would even prefer to give birth in the street rather than go to the doctors. Think about that. The people who were supposed to be the most educated were the most dangerous to be around. This gap became the crack in the old way of thinking. If the problem was just bad air, both clinics would have been the same, but they were not. There was a reason for this difference, and he had to find it. So he started crossing things off the list. He looked at crowding. But it turned out the midwives' clinic, the safe one, was more crowded. He looked at the way the women were lying down. Maybe the birthing position mattered. He changed the position in the first clinic to match the second. Nothing happened. He even looked at the priest. In the first clinic, a priest would walk through the ward ringing a bell when someone died. And Semmelweis wondered if the fear was literally scaring the other mothers to death. He had the priest walk a different way and stop ringing the bell. It did not matter. This is the part that gets me. Nothing was changing. He was stripping away every possible excuse. He was proving that the problem was not the room. It was not the air. And it was not the patient's state of mind. Now look at what was in those hands. The doctors and students in the first clinic were not just examining mothers. They were also researchers. Every morning, they would spend hours in the autopsy room, learning about anatomy by cutting into people who had died from every kind of disease. Then, and this is the part that gets me, they would walk straight from those dead bodies into the maternity ward. They did not change their clothes, and they did not really wash up. They just wiped their hands and started examining the women who were about to give birth. But the midwives in the safe clinic? They never went into the autopsy room. They stayed with the living. This was the one big difference. One group had a direct physical path from the dead to the living, and the other group did not. The doctors were the ones carrying something invisible across that hall every single day. A tragic accident provided the clue. In 1847, a friend and colleague of Semmelweis named Jakob Kolechka was performing an autopsy with a student. It was a routine day. But then the student slipped and poked Kolechka's finger with his knife. It was a tiny wound. But within a few days, Kolechka was dead. Semmelweis looked at the autopsy report for his friend, and he saw something that stopped him cold. The damage inside his friend's body looked exactly like the damage he saw inside the mothers who died of childbed fever. Think about that. Here was a man, not a woman, not a mother, dying of the exact same disease. This is the part that gets me. It meant the fever was not about bad air or being a mother. It was about whatever was on that knife. Semmelweis realized that if his friend died because cadaveric particles from a corpse got into a cut in his finger, then the mothers were dying because those same particles were being carried into them on the doctor's hands during examinations. The disease did not care about your constitution. It only cared about the physical path it took to get inside you. This result changed how he thought about everything happening in that ward. So what do you do when you realize your own hands are the root for a deadly disease? You act. Semmelweis did not wait for a perfect theory or a green light from the medical establishment. In 1847, he ordered every doctor and student in the first clinic to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime before they touched a patient. Now, why chlorinated lime? He chose it because the smell of the autopsy room was so stubborn that regular soap and water could not get it off. He figured that if the chemical was powerful enough to remove that corpse smell, it might be powerful enough to destroy the invisible particles he suspected were causing the fever. He did not know the exact biology of why it worked yet. Nobody did. But he knew he had to break that physical connection between the dead and the living. This was a direct, targeted attempt to decontaminate the hands and snap the transmission chain in half. The results were impossible to ignore. Once that hand-washing policy went into effect, the death rate in the first clinic did not just drop. It collapsed. Before Semmelweis stepped in, the mortality was sitting at roughly 18.27%. That means nearly 1 out of every 5 mothers who walked into that clinic was dying. But after they started using the chlorinated lime, that number plummeted to about 1.27%. Think about that for a second. This is not a subtle shift or some small statistical fluke. It is a total reversal of a catastrophe. In some months, the death rate hit 0. It was the kind of massive, undeniable proof that should have ended the entire argument right then and there. The physical path had been broken, and the mothers were finally staying alive to go home with their babies. You would think the hospital would be celebrating. But this is where things get difficult. But here is the problem. The evidence was attacking more than just a theory. It was attacking the status of the doctors themselves. Think about what Semmelweis was saying. He was not just suggesting a new way to clean the floor. He was telling these highly respected, educated men that they had been the ones killing their patients for years. To accept his discovery, a doctor would have to admit that his own hands, the very hands he used to heal and help, had been the instruments of death for hundreds of mothers. That is a heavy thing to carry. I do not think most of these men could handle that realization. They did not see themselves as carriers of filth. They saw themselves as gentlemen. And in those days, there was this powerful idea that a gentleman's hands were clean, simply because of his social standing. By asking them to wash with harsh chemicals, Semmelweis was essentially telling them they were dirty. The resistance was not really about the biology. You cannot argue with the death rate dropping from 18% to 1%. It was about professional ego. They chose to protect their image rather than admit their old habits were lethal. It shows you that in science, sometimes the hardest thing to change is not the theory. It is the person holding it. The numbers were screaming the truth. But the people in the room were too insulted to listen. Part of the issue was what they did not know yet. I find it remarkable that even with the data staring them in the face, they could not see it, because they did not have the right map. In 1847, germ theory was not a thing yet. Scientists like Louis Pasteur had not shown the world their work. And Joseph Lister had not started cleaning up surgery. So when Semmelweis talked about cadaveric particles, it sounded like a vague guess to his peers. He was right about the route. But he did not have the microscopic proof to make it stick. Think about that. He had discovered the how, the physical path of the contamination, but he could not explain the what, the actual bacteria. To his colleagues, who were still obsessed with bad air and the balance of fluids in the body, his hand-washing rule felt like a step back into superstition. They wanted a theory that fit their existing textbooks. And since he could not show them a germ under a lens, They felt they could ignore the lives he was saving. It is a classic problem. Being right in practice is hard to sell when you are wrong in the theory of the day. This brings us to the man himself. Ignaz Semmelweis was not exactly a diplomat, and as he watched the medical world turn its back on his discovery, he did not just walk away quietly. He got loud. He became obsessed. He started writing these furious open letters to famous doctors all over Europe, calling them murderers for not adopting hand washing. Now, you can imagine how that went over in a world built on prestige and hierarchy. Strange, right? The man who had solved the mystery became the most hated person in the room. He was eventually pushed out of his position in Vienna, and the man who had saved mothers became the person the institution wanted to stop hearing from. I find it remarkable that someone could hold the key to saving thousands of lives and yet be treated like a nuisance because he would not stop shouting the truth. He was right. But he was becoming more isolated every single day. It did not end well for him. By 1865, the constant rejection and the weight of all those unnecessary deaths finally broke him. His behavior became erratic. He would wander the streets of Budapest, stopping random couples to lecture them about the danger of unwashed hands. His family eventually realized he was losing his grip, and they tricked him into visiting what he thought was a new medical facility. It was not a clinic. It was an asylum. When he realized the trap and tried to fight his way out, the guards were brutal. There are accounts that describe him being beaten and thrown into a dark cell. But here is the part that is almost too much to believe. During that struggle, he suffered a wound on his hand. That wound became infected. Within 2 weeks, the man who had spent his entire life trying to stop doctors from spreading infection died from a massive infection in his own blood. Think about that. The very thing he had identified, the cadaveric particles entering a wound, was exactly what killed him. He died alone at 47, a victim of the same biological mechanism he had tried to warn the world about. It is an incredibly heavy, tragic ending for a man who deserved to be a hero. But the story does not stay dark forever. In the years after he died, the world finally caught up to the truth he had already found. A scientist named Louis Pasteur provided the missing piece, the theory of germs. That proved diseases were caused by microscopic organisms, not bad air or bad luck. Then Joseph Lister brought that theory into the operating room, showing that antiseptic discipline could save lives on a massive scale. Once germ theory was accepted, everything Semmelweis had done stopped looking like an insult and started looking like a miracle. The cadaveric particles he mentioned were not a mystery anymore. They were a biological reality that everyone could finally see through a microscope. He had been right all along, even if he did not have the words to explain why. I think about this story every time I see someone reject a new idea, just because it is uncomfortable. There is a name for it now. The Semmelweis reflex. It is that knee-jerk reaction where we dismiss new evidence out of hand simply because it contradicts the way we think the world works. You see, the real tragedy in Vienna was not just that those 19th century doctors were wrong about biology. It was that they were protecting a worldview that made them feel respectable and important. We all have this drive inside us. When a new discovery suggests that we might be part of the problem, or that we have been doing things wrong for years, our first instinct is not to say thank you. It is to get defensive. We look for reasons to ignore the numbers, so we do not have to feel guilt. We tell ourselves that the data is flawed, or the person presenting it is just being difficult, or the old way has always worked well enough for everyone else. It is a biological defense mechanism for the ego. The Semmelweis reflex shows us that being scientifically right is not always enough to win an argument. You also must deal with the person on the other side of the table who does not want to admit they were wrong. If we are not willing to be humbled by the truth, then all the evidence in the world will not change our behavior. That is the lesson he left behind. And I think it is one we are still struggling with today, back in that kitchen I mentioned. The real tragedy is not just that a contaminated hand touched the wrong thing. The disaster is when someone points to the hand and the room decides they would rather stay sick than admit they were messy. Semmelweis was destroyed, not because his idea was weak, but because it was simple enough to make guilt impossible to hide. He showed them the root, and they